There we go. Thank you very much to Professor Ignacio Corona and Eugenia Romero for inviting me to this talk. I'm really thrilled to be presenting beside full professor, or esteemed professors, Tanya Saunders and Steve Butterman. Feel a little nervous, but that's okay.
You're my friend. Friends in college.
So the title of my talk is Canceled Pride and Openness and Queer, Sexual Diversity Activism in Nicaragua. This is based on some research that I did this past summer through a Tinker grant that was provided through the Center for Latin American Studies here at Ohio State. So thank you very much for that opportunity. I'd like to start out my talk with an article that was actually sent to me by Professor Laura Podolsky, my email yesterday, in the New York Times, and it really struck my attention. This is in the debate section in the New York Times, in the opinion pages, and the title of the series of articles is "Why is Latin America so progressive on gay rights?" You know? And I think that this title was extremely provocative for me in three ways. And I'd like to use this as sort of an introduction to my talk. So, number one, I think that the title belies like a sort of bias through sort of like North American journalism. So it's sort of expecting underdevelopment and tercermundismo and machismo compared to North American exceptionalism. I think that this title sort of said, well, it's so strange that they would be progressive on gay rights. And second, it really brought to my attention what is meant by gay rights. Through the series of articles or opinion pieces in this section, mostly the articles are speaking of the right to gay marriage, a gay right, singular, no? Gay marriage in Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Brazil. And that brought me to my third question: what do we mean by Latin America? No, and in the articles, they were mostly referencing Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, the richest and most populous nations in Latin America. So I thought I would compare this to my experiences in Nicaragua. So is Nicaragua part of the gay rights, in quotations, trend in Latin America? And the answer is yes and no, as it turns out. So I have a couple tidbits that I'd like to share in reference to that question. So until 2008, actually between the periods of 1993 and 2008, Nicaragua had the strictest anti-sodomy laws on the books in the continent. I'd actually like to read part of Article 204 of the Penal Code that was in 2003. It mandated up to 3 years imprisonment for, quote, anyone who induces, promotes, propagandizes, or practices in scandalous form sexual intercourse between persons of the same sex. So this targeted not only men but also women, which is interesting in terms of anti-sodomy laws. And it's a law that threatened to incarcerate potentially anyone who wrote about, spoke about, or propagandized the subject of homosexuality in any way. You know, I think this is interesting in light of some of the recent legal changes in Russia. But since 2010, I believe, 2011, the current government has appointed an attorney general in charge of human rights of sexual diversity. So we've seen a drastic change from pre-2008 to the current era. But, I mean, as one might expect, things are still fairly sticky in terms of having full privileges under the law. So there's a group, the Strategic Group for Human Rights of Sexual Diversity in Nicaragua, that published a study in 2010. And in their study, they revealed that 100% of their interviewees of sexual diversity had experienced discrimination in educational institutions. They discovered that unemployment is higher among LGBT identified individuals, and 70% of interviewees had been arbitrarily held by the national police and reported discrimination and mistreatment. So I think I'm trying to point out that between having, on paper, an attorney general in charge of protecting human rights for sexual diversity, I think in practice and lived experience, there's a very different story to be told. So, my argument is sort of based on discourse versus lived experience. Going back to the articles in the New York Times, one of the comments on the article about Brazil, and we saw this in Steve's talk a little bit, he commented on the situation of living as a queer person in Brazil. Things are not all that pinkish in this beautiful, though unfair country. There are 246 countries in the world, of which 198 are members of the United Nations, including Brazil. Now, 44% of all crimes against LGBT in 2012 were committed here, throughout the world. So I'm trying to point out here that there's a very different thing between having legal discourse or court cases that supposedly protect you and living in a culture that allows you to live with dignity. So I look for the need or I suppose I should compare to my personal experience, although I don't mean to crudely compare human rights violations in Brazil with my personal experience, but my personal experience, I went to Nicaragua to observe the National Pride celebration that happens every June 28th, and my plans were thwarted because the Pride was canceled or postponed to a week later, because there happened to be a cumbre, summit of Petro-Caribe interests, of presidents and chancellors of Petro-Caribe interests that needed to occupy that space. So Pride was, even though the National Police had given the orders and approved for the Pride celebration to take place by Metro Centro, in the center of the city, they decided by whim that they could completely just postpone this due to oil interests. So I think I'm trying to show the difference between having on paper, approval by the police in order to carry out a certain event and lived experience. So my argument in this presentation as I analyze the actions of the Nicaraguan government concerning the Pride Festival of 2013 in Managua, and an event that was organized parallel to the Pride event, Openness and Queer, to show how current sexual diversity activists in Managua are compromising with both local needs and global discourses in order to improve the quality of life of Nicaragua's sexual diversity. So that's my main takeaway. So in order to start, I wanted to go over a brief history of Pride celebrations in Nicaragua. So I think before doing like a very linear chronology, I'd like to mention that there is a festival in Masaya, which is a small town outside of Managua. It's the Fiesta del Toro Venado, which is based on an indigenous practice, wherein there's several. It's become sort of an informal gay pride celebration. Masaya is also known as having a much larger sexual diversity population, and this has occurred throughout recent history. I could talk about how more recently it's included corporate sponsorship and support from NGOs and how that's changed the festival, but I want to point out that throughout Nicaraguan history there's been a place for sexual diversity in folk festivals. But the first official Pride that took place in Nicaragua was in 1989. Is during the 10th celebration of the Sandinista Revolution, which might surprise a few people. And during this celebration, this first act of Pride, there were approximately 30 gay and lesbian Nicaraguans that marched to the Plaza de la Revolución in Managua in black t-shirts emblazoned with a pink triangle. And I think this is especially interesting that during Sandinismo, there was a certain amount of high visibility of sexual diverse people. Dora Maria Tellez, the second in command, was openly lesbian. Later, it was decided by the junta that they would never appoint openly lesbian politicians ever again. But they used international symbols in the 80s. The pink triangle, howling back to what during the Holocaust in Germany, what political prisoners deemed homosexual had to wear. So I think it's interesting that we're seeing an international influence, even in the first instance of gay pride in Managua. Also, it should be mentioned that gay pride parades are also an international import, starting in '69 in New York, the Stonewall riots. It was later repeated throughout Western Europe and in the United States. In 1991, this is after the defeat of the revolution by a liberal coalition and the first female president in Central America, a larger pride event was planned, including film, music, dance, and panel discussions. So you see a progression, I suppose, from a smaller pride to a larger pride during the era of liberalism. However, in 1993, under the same government with Doña Viole, the liberal coalition, Article 204 that I've mentioned is implemented in the new penal code. And the same year, there's a campaign, Sexuality Free of Prejudice, that takes place in Nicaragua that's launched. And this campaign continued onward through the liberal governments and continued through 2006 when Daniel Ortega was re-elected as the second sort of moment of socialism in Nicaragua. And by 2008, the anti-sodomy laws were repealed and Pride celebrations began to feature a more prominent trans participation. Trans mean transgender and transsexual. And that takes us to the present day, 2013, where Pride was postponed due to Petrocaribe oil interests, right? And Openness Queer is a parallel event, alternative to Pride, that was planned and actually was attended by most of the people who would have attended the official Pride celebration. So I would like to point out that Nicaragua might not be a shining example of LGBT rights, but it's certainly shown progress, right? And the general consensus among people that I spoke with during my research there agree that there's been a certain aperture to alternative sexuality since in the most recent years. So I would like to point out that the seeming contradictions in Nicaragua's politics toward LGBT people or sexual diversity seem to have their counterparts in the countries celebrated for their LGBT rights record, right? There's seeming contradictions in all these places. And this leads me to look closely at the differences between discourse and lived experience. In other words, between legal victories and cultural victories. Legal activism versus cultural activism. So, in my experience, Nicaraguan activists are acutely aware of the need to balance geopolitics with local politics, to look at the need of the community and to use a variety of strategies to benefit them, right? So, taking a couple ideas from some scholars who have studied Nicaraguan activism, Simon Howe, in her book Intimate Activism, cites Elizabeth Povinelli talking about the liberal diaspora of international gay and lesbian rights movements. And in her book, she describes how Nicaraguan activists are influenced by concepts of sexual subjectivity, ideals of romantic love, and most heavily the international lesbian and gay rights movements. And as part of the liberal diaspora, this is really a rights-based activism that she describes. That is also based on identity-based organizations, organizing as citizens, right? So in her book, she goes through sort of the coming of age of the lesbian identity in Nicaragua throughout the 90s. So most people of sexual diversity that identified as women in Nicaragua did not identify as lesbians until after there was a serious push by NGOs to have them adopt this identity. in order to better align it with a more international struggle for rights, right? So thinking of local needs in global discourses, I'd also like to point out about labels and identities, identity-based politics. One of the questions that Nicaraguan activists have to deal with is what best describes individuals and what gets broader recognition, both by NGOs and by international politics. So can you receive funding from an NGO if you don't identify a certain way, right? Or can you tag on to human rights discussions through the UN without identifying in a certain way? And I'd like to point out a series of cultural interventions, the strong history in Nicaragua of using cultural intervention as politics, stemming from during the Sandinista period through the liberal period in the present day. There's been a strong tradition of using radio programs. For example, there's Programa Feminista La Corriente. Sexto Sentido was a telenovela that was produced by an NGO that Simine Howe discusses in her televisionary activism. Photography, drag shows, and the yearly Miss Gay Nicaragua beauty pageant. That is interesting, but it's used as a platform to speak politically and to make cultural intervention. And I'd also like to point out that queer theory and cultural productions from the global north do heavily influence activists. Thinking of Tanya's talk, one of the major influences on a lot of activists that I spoke with is North American queer hip hop. So Cakes Tequila and Mickey Blanco feature heavily in the music that was played during Openness Queer. In fact, a lot of the queer theory that is used by activist groups is taken from cultural texts versus academic texts, which might make sense. So, in theorizing rights-based strategies, let's see how we are on time. I'd just like to briefly talk theoretically about the double-edged sword between having to appeal to a legal framework as well as international discourse in order to make concrete political change, right? And also recognizing possible disconnect between essentialism of identity and the needs of a community. And I'd like to point out that both political and cultural interventions, in my personal opinion, seem necessary. So one of those reasons is the way John Bell or David Bell and John Binney describe in their book, The Sexual Citizen, how sexual citizenship is used as an organizing tool. They highlight that citizenship is heterosexualized, and it is an enunciation of identity that is always already sexualized, with a heterosexual assumption. So they say here, the very notion of citizenship, while endlessly deconstructed and reconstructed, serves as a useful device for thinking about forms of political action and political identity. However, there will always be non-citizens, and there will always be those who live precariously in the margins of inclusion and exclusion. So the danger of joining the assimilationist agenda through them would be to assimilate to state politics, is precisely that those boundaries of inclusion can be expanded and contracted at political will. So I'm trying to extrapolate this argument a little bit with what happened when Pride was canceled in Nicaragua. That citizenship rights seem to be contracted at political whim, but the forming of a community and having mutual bonds is much less easily broken. So this brings me to my final point, the Openness and Queer, the event that was organized parallel to the official Pride celebration in Managua. So Openness and Queer was a reaction to the annual Pride March. The Pride March was seen by the group of activists that I was working with as a gesture that did not cultivate a space for dialogue and sharing of ideas, but rather it was an act of visibility for NGO-supported organizations. So Openness and Queer was designed to be a takeover, a toma oficial del Carabanchel, of a straight but gay-friendly bar to celebrate, discuss, and theorize the diversity of the sexual diversity community, right? So diversity within diversity would seem to be the main point of the conversation. And in this event, I'd really like to stress the amount of cultural interventions that were trying to be made. What I mean by cultural interventions, I mean the use of cultural texts to transmit affect and to build community in that way. So you see there was poetry, open mic, there were 2 photography expositions, there was a drag closet that was open to the public, so they could play with their gender expression. There were 2 performance pieces that were done by performance artists that were specifically focusing trans identity and the mutability and fluidity of gender expression. There was a manifesto that I helped to write and maybe perform. And there was DJing by a collective 23, along with a video exposition that also played with the fluidity of gender with music. So as you can see, transvestism or cross-dressing was suggested as part of the event, and that was mainly to foster an environment of fluidity of gender expression, to question patriarchy, to question normative masculinity and normative femininity, and I think one of the other really important aspects of Openness Queer is it focused on creating space. So, and it focused on creating space and recognizing what are known as cochones or cochones del barrio. So cochon is a somewhat derogative term for, it would be like viado, I suppose, in Portuguese. But cochon del barrio is usually referring to somebody from a neighborhood that has built their own space in their community. So if you say, conoces al cochon del barrio, people know who this person is. It's sort of a local institution of having contact. And this event, in several of the poems and in several of the speeches that were given in the open mic, they really highlighted the importance of intervening in your own neighborhood and in your family and creating effective ties between people that could be stronger than perhaps legal ties alone. Operación and la toma oficial refer to Nicaragua's revolutionary past. These terms, operación is very llamativo of the revolutionary period, where there are operations and takings of buildings. But I think poetically it also refers to the grassroots organization that happened on the neighborhood level during the revolution. Some of the most binding political organizations were neighborhood to neighborhood in Managua. And I think for the contemporary political climate of Nicaragua, which is both socialist and neoliberal, we see activists appealing to a number of different authorities in order to achieve results. So I think appealing to community, but also, as you can see, appealing to the Centro Cultural de España in Nicaragua, so to the Cultural Center of Spain in Nicaragua, and also the Cooperación Suiza in America Central. Grants were written to these groups to appeal to these NGOs, which a very different language was used, and then the language that was used in the actual event. So the money was still gotten, so that was good. And I think the third thing that I'd like to point out is why queer? Why Operación Queer? Why did the organizers of the event choose queer? And I think through the open mic discussions and discussions with the activists, the way queer is being used in this was being used in this event. Hopefully, it's become an annual event. We're planning for the next year. But hopefully, what this means, or at least my understanding of what this means, is a critical approach to sexuality, not necessarily an umbrella term like diversidad sexual, but a critical approach to sexuality that takes into account normative gender, that takes into account privilege, and that takes into account patriarchy. So it's a critical approach, and instead of an umbrella term. So I have a couple photos as well of the event. As you can see in the background, there's a photograph exposition. This is during the open mic part. And this is the very opening. This is attended by over 600 people, which is estimated to be 2 times the amount of people that would assist the regular Pride presentation in Managua. So it was considered by the organizers to be an astounding victory. So in conclusion, while Openness and Queer and perhaps other similar cultural events are not being celebrated in the way that monumental court decisions or the passing of laws are, they are nonetheless inspirational and important political interventions. And I think it shows how Nicaraguan activist culture can address both global discourses and local needs, forming community, questioning identity politics, and intervening culturally in order to combat a culture of homophobia, transphobia, patriarchy. So that's pretty much what I have.